In the sweltering summer of 1680, the marble corridors of Madrid's royal palace resonated with whispers that would haunt the Spanish court for generations. Behind gilded doors and beneath crystal chandeliers, a secret festered, one that would ultimately unravel the mightiest dynasty Europe had ever seen. This is not a story of battlefields or rebellion, but of something far more insidious. The gradual, calculated downfall of a bloodline that once believed itself chosen by God. What you are about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about royal authority and the hidden price of absolute power. The Habsburg dynasty had ruled Spain for over 2 centuries. Their empire stretched from the Americas to the Philippines, with wealth pouring like rivers of gold from the New World. Yet, by 1680, this powerful empire was rotting from within, poisoned by an obsession more deadly than any foreign army could inflict. The Spanish Habsburgs had become prisoners of their own ideology, ensnared in a web of their making, where blood purity was considered more valuable than life itself, and political ambition more sacred than health. Princess Margarita Theresa of Spain should have been the jewel of European royalty. Born into unimaginable wealth and privilege, she was destined for glory. Her hand was sought by emperors and kings across the continent. Instead, she became a living symbol of everything gone awry in the Spanish royal family. Contemporary accounts describe a young woman whose mere presence cleared rooms, whose condition was so unsettling that even the most hardened courtiers recoiled in disgust. The princess suffered from a medical condition so severe that no perfume, no quantity of rosewater, no collection of exotic remedies could conceal its effects. Witnesses recalled a stench so overpowering that it seemed to emanate from her very being, a scent that spoke of internal decay and systematic collapse. This was not a common illness. It was the physical manifestation of a genetic catastrophe, the outcome of generations of decisions prioritizing political gain over biological reality. Margarita Theresa was not alone in this suffering. Her brother, the future King Carlos II, would inherit not only the Spanish throne, but a body so compromised by genetic defects that he struggled to function as a human being, let alone as a monarch. Together, these siblings marked the tragic final chapter of one of history's greatest dynasties. Their existence was a living testament to the devastating consequences of royal inbreeding. The Habsburg family tree had become a genetic nightmare, a twisted maze where cousins married cousins, uncles wed nieces, and the same diseased blood circulated through generation after generation. What began as a calculated political strategy had evolved into a systematic experiment in self-destruction, with the royal family serving as unwitting subjects. This obsession with blood purity was not unique to Spain, but nowhere else had it been pursued with such ruthless determination. The Spanish Habsburgs had concentrated their genetic line to the point where it could no longer sustain itself. In doing so, they condemned both their family and their empire to inevitable decline. The year 1680 marked more than just a personal tragedy for Princess Margarita Theresa and Carlos II. It signaled a turning point in dynastic Europe. As the princess's condition worsened and her brother struggled with even basic royal responsibilities, foreign courts began to circle like vultures, sensing the approaching collapse of Habsburg power. The empire that had once terrified nations now inspired a mix of pity and barely concealed anticipation. The story of royal inbreeding traces back to medieval times, when European monarchs first discovered that strategic marriages could consolidate power, forge alliances, and prevent the fragmentation of kingdoms. Initially, this system was highly effective, allowing royal families to maintain control over vast territories while keeping wealth and influence concentrated within a small circle. The practice seemed logical, even divinely sanctioned, a way to preserve the sacredness of royal blood. The House of Habsburg had mastered this art better than any family in European history. Through carefully orchestrated marriages, they assembled an empire spanning continents, controlling trade routes, colonies, and military resources on a scale unmatched elsewhere. Their motto, Bella Garant Ali, Tu Felix Austria nubi. Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry, reflected a belief that matrimonial strategy could achieve what armies could not. Yet, the Habsburg marriage policy contained a fatal flaw, one that would only become apparent after multiple generations. As the family's power grew, so did their isolation from other noble bloodlines. They increasingly saw themselves as fundamentally different, believing their blood carried exceptional qualities, making them uniquely suited to rule. This sense of superiority gradually restricted marriages to within their extended family. The Spanish branch of the Habsburgs, established when Charles V divided his empire between Spanish and Austrian territories, became particularly obsessed with maintaining blood purity. Unlike their Austrian cousins, who occasionally married outsiders, the Spanish Habsburgs viewed any dilution of their bloodline as a betrayal of divine mandate. This decision would become their undoing. By the mid-17th century, the Spanish Habsburg family tree resembled a series of closed loops rather than branching structures. Cousins routinely married cousins, and the genetic diversity necessary for healthy offspring vanished. Each generation saw an increase in birth defects, mental disabilities, and physical deformities. Rather than recognizing these as warning signs, the royal family interpreted them as tests of faith or temporary afflictions that could be overcome through prayer and medicine. Court physicians found themselves in an impossible position, bound by protocol and terrified of contradicting royal ideology. They could see the mounting evidence of genetic damage but dared not suggest that the marriage practices were responsible. Instead, they offered desperate remedies, from bloodletting to exotic imported treatments, all while the true cause of the problem remained unchecked. Religious authorities further perpetuated the cycle. The Catholic Church, deeply entwined with Spanish royal power, provided theological justification for the Habsburg marriage practices, claiming God had chosen the family to rule and that maintaining blood purity was a sacred duty. Any suggestion that these unions were harmful was treated as heresy, silencing the few voices who might have warned of impending catastrophe. Foreign observers, particularly diplomats from rival nations, began noting the deteriorating condition of the Spanish royal family by the early 17th century. Venetian ambassadors, French courtiers, and English diplomats sent detailed reports describing the physical and mental decline they witnessed at court. Preserved in diplomatic archives, these accounts provide some of the most detailed evidence of the Habsburg genetic crisis. Princess Margarita Theresa's birth in 1651 was initially celebrated as a triumph for the dynasty. She was the daughter of King Philip IV of Spain and his niece Mariana of Austria, a union exemplifying the family's commitment to internal consolidation. The princess was fourth in line to the throne and immediately recognized as one of Europe's most eligible royal brides, with potential unions viewed as crucial for forging political alliances. Yet it quickly became apparent that Margarita Theresa was not the healthy, vibrant princess her court had hoped for. Contemporary accounts describe a child struggling with basic physical development, lacking the energy and vitality expected of royal offspring. As she grew, her condition worsened, manifesting in ways that horrified even seasoned courtiers. The most disturbing aspect of the princess's condition was an overwhelming odor, so intense it could reportedly be detected from a distance. This was not poor hygiene or medical neglect. It signaled something far more serious. Internal processes gone wrong, a symptom of deep genetic failure. Court physicians tried everything, from herbal remedies to exotic spices, but nothing could mask or remove the stench, which became her defining characteristic. The impact on court life was immediate and profound. Social gatherings that would normally feature the princess prominently were restructured to minimize her presence. Diplomatic receptions became exercises in careful choreography, with ambassadors positioned as far from her as possible while still maintaining the appearance of respect. Even the architecture of ceremonies had to be adjusted to accommodate her condition. Personal accounts from courtiers and servants reveal heartbreaking glimpses of her daily existence. Margarita Theresa was reportedly aware of the effect she had on others, leading to increasing isolation and withdrawal from public life. The young woman, destined to be at the center of Spanish high society, found herself relegated to the margins, her suffering, both physical and emotional, intensified by her awareness. Marriage negotiations for Princess Margarita. Teresa began early, as was customary for royal offspring, but her condition presented unprecedented difficulties for Spanish diplomats. Potential suitors, initially drawn by the political advantages of an alliance with Spain, withdrew their interest once they became aware of the princess's health issues. This placed Spanish negotiators in an almost impossible position, tasked with arranging advantageous marriages while attempting to conceal information that would inevitably become evident to any serious candidate. The princess's younger brother, Carlos, born in 1661, would come to exemplify Habsburg genetic deterioration even more starkly. From birth, it was apparent that Carlos suffered from multiple severe disabilities that would affect nearly every aspect of his life. He was unable to walk until age 4, struggled with speech throughout his childhood and adolescence, and exhibited cognitive limitations that made even basic comprehension of governance and statecraft extremely difficult. Carlos's physical appearance quickly became a subject of intense speculation and barely concealed horror among European courts. The infamous Habsburg jaw, a genetic trait that had grown increasingly pronounced over generations, reached its most extreme form in Carlos. His lower jaw protruded so dramatically that closing his mouth was nearly impossible, making both eating and speaking exceedingly challenging. His tongue was reportedly so large that it further hampered clear communication. The young prince's condition extended beyond facial deformities. Contemporary observers described him as extremely short in stature, with a disproportionately large head, uncoordinated limbs, and an awkward gait. He suffered from what now appears to have been epilepsy, experiencing seizures that intensified in both frequency and severity as he aged. His overall health was so fragile that court physicians lived in constant fear he might die at any moment, leaving Spain without a clear heir to the throne. Mental disabilities compounded Carlos's physical challenges, producing a situation that would have been tragic for any individual, but was particularly catastrophic for someone destined to rule a global empire. He exhibited what modern experts would recognize as severe cognitive delays, struggling to acquire basic skills and showing minimal understanding of the complex political and military demands confronting Spain. Despite these obvious limitations, Spanish court protocol required that Carlos be treated as the future king, prepared for the role he would never fully be able to fulfill. This created a bizarre and ultimately futile educational program in which tutors and advisors attempted to impart statecraft to someone who could barely manage personal care. The stark contrast between Spain's critical international position and the limited capabilities of its future ruler produced a sense of looming catastrophe that permeated every level of court life. The implications of the royal family's condition extended far beyond personal tragedy. Spain faced mounting threats from rival European powers, colonial unrest, and economic instability that demanded decisive leadership and strategic vision. Instead, the country was ruled by King Philip IV, himself a product of inbreeding, who would be succeeded by a son whose disabilities rendered effective governance impossible. Foreign intelligence services soon focused intensely on the question of Spanish succession. Recognizing that Carlos's inevitable death without heirs could trigger a power vacuum capable of reshaping the European balance of power, diplomats from France, Austria, and England cultivated networks of informants within the Spanish court to gather detailed intelligence on the king's health and the likelihood of producing an heir. These espionage efforts would later play a pivotal role in the complex diplomatic maneuvering that followed Carlos's death. The Spanish court's attempts to address the royal family's health problems highlighted the limitations of 17th-century medicine and the dangerous intersection of politics, religion, and science. Physicians representing the era's most advanced medical knowledge were entirely unprepared to treat genetic disorders, which would remain scientifically mysterious for another 2 centuries. Their interventions, ranging from bloodletting to exotic herbal concoctions, frequently exacerbated the patient's conditions rather than alleviating them. Religious interpretations of the royal family's suffering grew increasingly influential as medical treatments failed. Spanish Catholic theology offered several frameworks for understanding physical affliction, from divine punishment for sins to spiritual trials designed to test the family's worthiness to govern. These explanations conveniently removed any suspicion that human actions, specifically the family's marriage practices, might be at the root of the crisis. Exorcisms and other spiritual interventions were carried out multiple times, particularly as Carlos's seizures and neurological symptoms were interpreted as potential signs of demonic influence. These dramatic ceremonies, attended by high-ranking church officials and court dignitaries, provided public spectacles meant to demonstrate royal piety while offering hope that supernatural intervention might succeed where medical treatment had failed. The Spanish Inquisition's involvement in royal health matters added yet another layer of complexity. Always vigilant for heresy or witchcraft, the Inquisition investigated various theories regarding the causes of the Habsburgs' ailments, including suspicions that foreign enemies might have cursed the bloodline. While these inquiries proved fruitless, they fostered an atmosphere of paranoia and distrust that further complicated attempts to address the real origins of the crisis. Foreign medical experts were sometimes consulted, but their ability to provide effective care was limited by both the primitive state of medical science and the political sensitivity surrounding royal health. Any physician suggesting that the family's marriage practices might be contributing to their condition risked accusations of espionage or heresy. As a result, consultations were largely restricted to those willing to operate within strict ideological constraints. The financial burden of the royal family's medical care became considerable as Spain diverted substantial resources from other pressing matters to fund elaborate and costly treatments. Exotic remedies were imported from across the globe. Specialist physicians were brought in from other countries, and complex therapeutic regimens were implemented, all with negligible improvement in the family's condition. These expenditures symbolized not only economic waste, but also an acknowledgement of the dynasty's vulnerability. Alternative medical traditions, including Islamic and Jewish medical knowledge that had previously been accessible in Spain, were systematically excluded from treatment plans due to religious and political considerations. The court's rigid adherence to ideology, combined with limited medical understanding, left the Habsburgs trapped in a cycle of futile intervention. Each new remedy, each elaborate procedure offered temporary hope, but ultimately failed to address the underlying genetic reality. For the Spanish Habsburgs, every public ceremony, every diplomatic reception, and every daily routine became a delicate balancing act between appearances and reality. The fragility of Carlos and Margarita Theresa shaped not only court life, but Spain's international reputation as foreign powers closely observed the dynasty's decline. The intersection of inbreeding, inadequate medical knowledge, religious orthodoxy, and political ambition produced a perfect storm, leaving Spain vulnerable and the royal family increasingly isolated within its own palace walls. This limitation further reduced the already narrow chances of finding effective treatments, as some of the most advanced medical thinking of the period was rendered inaccessible by prevailing ideological barriers. The psychological impact of the royal family's condition on Spanish society was both profound and far-reaching. For a population that had long been taught to see their monarchs as divinely appointed representatives of God on earth, the visible physical and mental limitations of their rulers created a crisis of faith that extended far beyond mere questions of succession. If God had truly chosen the Habsburg family to govern Spain, why were they so clearly afflicted by what appeared to be divine punishment? Popular explanations for royal illness ranged widely, from supernatural curses to conspiracies orchestrated by foreign powers, but increasingly, ordinary Spaniards began to question the very foundations of their political system. The stark contrast between royal rhetoric about divine authority and the observable reality of royal disability could not be ignored. fueling clandestine discussions about the legitimacy of the monarchy and the true relationship between rulers and subjects. Spanish literature and art from this era subtly reflect this growing unease, though authors and painters were careful to employ coded language to avoid direct criticism of the crown. Court painters faced a delicate challenge: how to produce official portraits that preserved the dignity of royalty while acknowledging the unmistakable physical limitations of their subjects. The resulting body of royal portraiture from this period often carries an almost surreal quality, portraying visibly impaired individuals as symbols of power and sovereignty. Religious art and architecture from the same period similarly reflect the anxiety permeating Spanish society. Churches frequently commissioned works emphasizing suffering, redemption, and divine mystery, which may have been attempts by both clergy and patrons to reconcile the apparent contradiction between the royal family's claims to divine favor and their visibly compromised health. The Baroque artistic movement, which flourished in 17th century Spain, can in part be understood as a cultural response to this fundamental uncertainty regarding the nature of divine authority. The Spanish nobility, acutely sensitive to cues from the royal family regarding proper behavior and values, found themselves navigating an increasingly fraught social landscape. As the consequences of Habsburg inbreeding became more apparent, aristocratic marriage practices, long modeled on royal precedent, faced new scrutiny. Many noble houses had historically relied on intermarriage to maintain political influence and consolidate wealth. But the mounting evidence of genetic decline posed a dilemma: continue following royal example and risk their own familial health, or break with tradition and risk losing favor with the crown. Responses varied. Some noble families persisted in arranging marriages within their extended kinship networks, while others sought alliances with foreign houses that offered greater genetic diversity. These decisions carried profound long-term implications for Spain's social and political fabric, highlighting the interconnectedness of royal example, aristocratic decision-making, and national stability. The Spanish military's response to the royal family's condition offers further insight into the practical ramifications of this genetic crisis. Commanders of the army and navy, responsible for protecting Spain's far-flung empire, were often forced to operate under a monarchy whose leaders displayed severe cognitive and physical limitations. This created informal power structures that bypassed the formal chain of command, as experienced officers assumed responsibilities traditionally belonging to royal commanders. Knowledge of the monarchy's incapacity inevitably influenced foreign military planners who could calculate Spanish vulnerability with greater precision. Spain's long-standing reputation as a military powerhouse, built over generations of strategic campaigns, began to erode as reports of royal disabilities spread through diplomatic channels. Economic consequences were equally profound. Spain's intricate commercial and colonial networks demanded sophisticated management and strategic oversight, tasks increasingly compromised by the declining cognitive capabilities of the monarchy. Trade policies, colonial administration, and fiscal oversight all suffered. As the king's attention was increasingly diverted to personal health concerns, Spanish merchants and colonial officials often operated with minimal guidance, resulting in inconsistent policies and missed opportunities. This, in turn, benefited rival European powers eager to exploit Spain's internal instability. The once formidable Spanish bureaucracy, long admired by other European states for its efficiency, gradually lost its coherence. As royal authority weakened, so did the capacity of central institutions to coordinate effectively. Foreign intelligence and economic observers recognized these weaknesses, and English, French, and Dutch commercial interests developed strategies to capitalize on Spain's domestic instability. The colonial consequences were especially significant. Territories in the Americas and Asia, reliant on steady political attention and military reinforcement, increasingly operated with local autonomy. This created openings for foreign intervention and contributed to the long-term decline of Spanish imperial influence. Marriage negotiations involving Princess Margarita Theresa and Prince Carlos became exercises in intricate diplomatic maneuvering, highlighting the extent to which Spain's foreign policy was compromised by the royal family's genetic deterioration. Spanish ambassadors negotiated from a position of inherent weakness, aware that their royal relatives were unlikely to meet the expectations of healthy foreign suitors. Yet, openly acknowledging this would have undermined Spain's international prestige, so negotiations often relied on extensive financial incentives to offset the risks associated with Habsburg bloodlines. Dowries grew exceptionally large, draining Spanish coffers while producing only temporary diplomatic advantage. Foreign courts, in turn, developed sophisticated intelligence networks focused on monitoring the health and reproductive potential of Spanish royalty. Marriage discussions became opportunities for espionage, as ambassadors and their agents gathered detailed medical information to inform national strategy. The intimate details of royal health thus assumed profound international significance. The repeated failure of these alliances to yield healthy offspring compounded diplomatic challenges. Partner nations, bound by treaties intended to cement lasting alliances, instead faced the reality of entanglement with a declining dynasty. Many sought ways to distance themselves discreetly, avoiding overt violation of formal agreements while minimizing genetic and political exposure. Princess Margarita Theresa's death in 1673 at the age of 21 was officially attributed to various medical causes, yet contemporaries recognized her as a victim of generational inbreeding. Her passing removed one of the most visible symbols of Habsburg genetic decline, extinguishing any hope that she might produce heirs capable of sustaining Spain's royal lineage. The elaborate funeral ceremonies that followed attempted to mask the grim reality of her death, framing it instead as a testament to divine providence. Religious authorities delivered sermons emphasizing mystery and the acceptance of God's will, carefully avoiding acknowledgement of human agency in the unfolding tragedy. International response underscored the extent to which foreign powers monitored the Spanish genetic crisis. Diplomatic correspondence reveals that other European states interpreted her death as a confirmation of Habsburg decline, seizing the opportunity to accelerate preparations for the impending Spanish succession crisis. Posthumous medical examinations, limited by contemporary scientific knowledge, provided further evidence of systemic genetic damage. Physicians documented multiple organ anomalies and developmental issues, indicative of hereditary disorder, though the underlying causes remained scientifically unrecognized. Prince Carlos's eventual accession as Carlos II in 1665 introduced an unprecedented scenario. A major European empire, ruled by a monarch whose profound cognitive and physical disabilities made effective governance impossible. His early reign relied heavily on regency arrangements and court factionalism, all operating under the fiction that the king possessed the faculties to rule. Court protocols were extensively modified to accommodate his limitations, giving rise to ceremonial structures designed to conceal the reality of royal incapacity from public scrutiny. State ceremonies were carefully choreographed to minimize Carlos's need for speech or complex cognitive engagement, reducing his role to symbolic appearances. International relations during his reign were similarly managed through a network of advisors, ministers, and courtiers who exercised practical control under the guise of royal authority. Foreign diplomats quickly adapted, recognizing that formal titles belied the reality of decision-making, which rested in the hands of those operating behind the throne. The economic and administrative functions of the monarchy followed a similar pattern. The king's inability to oversee state affairs meant that ministers and bureaucrats assumed unprecedented responsibility for policy implementation, creating layers of indirect governance. These structures allowed Spain to maintain superficial stability, but strategic cohesion and long-term planning suffered. The perceived weakness of the monarchy encouraged rival European powers to press their own advantages, further undermining Spain's position on the continent and overseas. Despite these challenges, the court continued to maintain the appearance of order. Elaborate rituals, ceremonial obedience, and pageantry masked the dysfunction at the heart of the monarchy, projecting a facade of legitimacy to both domestic audiences and foreign observers. Yet beneath this veneer, the empire's governance relied increasingly on informal networks, discretionary judgment, and the initiative of capable advisors rather than on monarchical authority. Carlos's reign ultimately serves as a stark illustration of the consequences of dynastic inbreeding. The Habsburg family's genetic decline had tangible effects on Spain's political, military, economic, and social systems. From disrupted succession planning and compromised foreign diplomacy to weakened colonial administration and constrained military strategy, the empire felt the repercussions of a royal lineage increasingly ill-equipped to fulfill its responsibilities. Each decision, delay, or misstep was magnified by the king's limitations, demonstrating how the personal health of a monarch could reverberate through the structures of a global power. The question of royal succession dominated Carlos's entire reign, as it became increasingly evident that he would never be capable of producing children to continue the Habsburg line. Efforts to arrange marriages for the king became desperate attempts to find a bride who might somehow overcome the severe genetic obstacles that hindered royal reproduction. Yet, these efforts were doomed from the outset due to the extreme extent of Carlos's disabilities. Foreign intelligence agencies closely monitored Carlos's health and reproductive activities, fully aware that his death would trigger a succession crisis capable of fundamentally reshaping the European balance of power. The most intimate details of royal married life were elevated to matters of international strategic concern. As European governments braced for the inevitable end of the Spanish Habsburg line, medical interventions for Carlos grew increasingly desperate. Court physicians, recognizing the futility of conventional remedies, attempted a wide array of treatments. Experimental procedures, exotic imported medicines, and even surgical operations were carried out, all without meaningful improvement. These repeated failures became emblematic of the broader collapse of the Spanish system, which proved unable to confront the genetic crisis ravaging its royal family. The financial burden of Carlos's medical care weighed heavily on Spanish resources throughout his reign as increasingly elaborate and expensive remedies were pursued in hopes of restoring royal health and fertility. These expenditures were not only a financial drain, but also a symbolic acknowledgement that the monarchy had become reliant on external remedies for problems that were inherently hereditary. The final years of Carlos II's reign, culminating in his death in 1700, marked the conclusive collapse of the Spanish Habsburg genetic experiment. His passing without an heir sparked the War of the Spanish Succession, a massive European conflict that confirmed the end of Habsburg rule in Spain and ushered in a new dynastic era under the Bourbon family. The international response to Carlos's death revealed how meticulously other European powers had prepared for this moment, with detailed succession plans and military strategies ready to exploit the vacuum left by the Habsburgs. The genetic crisis that had begun with marital strategies ultimately escalated into international warfare, reshaping political alliances across Europe. The legacy of the Spanish Habsburg genetic experiment extends far beyond the immediate political ramifications of dynastic failure. The meticulous documentation of genetic decline in one of Europe's most powerful families provided future medical researchers with crucial evidence regarding the dangers of extreme inbreeding. Modern genetic analysis of Habsburg family members has validated many historical observations, confirming the accumulation of genetic defects within the Spanish royal bloodline. Scientific studies have pinpointed specific genetic mutations that became concentrated over generations of cousin marriages, providing tangible evidence supporting contemporary theories proposed by some observers of the time. The Spanish Habsburg case became a cautionary example that influenced royal marriage practices throughout Europe. Other dynasties gradually recognized the risks of replicating the Spanish model too closely. The once dominant concept of blood purity, which had guided Habsburg marital strategies, was increasingly abandoned in favor of alliances that prioritized genetic health over ideological or dynastic purity. Educational and medical institutions began to use the Habsburg story as a teaching tool, illustrating the principles of genetic inheritance and the importance of diversity in human populations. A family once celebrated as the pinnacle of human achievement had become a textbook example of genetic failure, their tragic story educating future generations about the dangers of systematic inbreeding. The architectural and artistic legacy of the Spanish Habsburgs offers a complex monument to the interplay between political power and genetic health. Magnificent palaces, churches, and public structures commissioned during the Habsburg era testify to the empire's wealth and ambition, yet they also bear silent witness to the human cost of the genetic experiment that ultimately doomed the dynasty. Preservation efforts have maintained many Habsburg-era sites as educational resources, allowing modern visitors to explore the environments where genetic decline unfolded. These preserved spaces provide unique insights into daily royal life during a period of mounting disability, showing how political ceremonies and court protocols were adapted to accommodate physical and cognitive impairments. The architectural and artistic legacy of the Spanish Habsburgs offers a complex monument to the interplay between political power and genetic health. Magnificent palaces, churches, and public structures commissioned during the Habsburg era testify to the empire's wealth and ambition, yet they also bear silent witness to the human cost of the genetic experiment that ultimately doomed the dynasty. Preservation efforts have maintained many Habsburg-era sites as educational resources, allowing modern visitors to explore the environments where genetic decline unfolded. These preserved spaces provide unique insights into daily royal life during a period of mounting disability, showing how political ceremonies and court protocols were adapted to accommodate physical and cognitive impairments. Museum collections of Habsburg portraits, personal artifacts, and medical records offer additional evidence of the progression of genetic deterioration within the royal family. These materials allow both researchers and the public to examine firsthand how hereditary decline was documented, concealed, and ultimately accepted as an inescapable aspect of royal life. The transformation of Habsburg medical files into historical documents has produced invaluable resources for medical historians and scholars interested in the intersections of politics, religion, and science in early modern Europe. These records provide detailed accounts of how genetic disorders were interpreted and treated before the advent of modern medicine, highlighting both the limitations and innovations of 17th-century medical practice. The contemporary relevance of the Spanish Habsburg genetic crisis extends beyond mere historical curiosity, informing debates about genetic engineering, reproductive technologies, and the ethics of manipulating inheritance. The Habsburg example functions as a natural experiment in human genetics, illustrating both the potential consequences and risks of attempting to control hereditary outcomes. Medical geneticists continue to study the Habsburg case to better understand how genetic disorders accumulate in isolated populations. Research derived from Habsburg genetic data has informed modern genetic counseling, reproductive medicine, and the importance of preemptive genetic screening to prevent hereditary disorders. Educational institutions use the Habsburg story to teach students about the complex interplay between political authority, social ideology, and scientific knowledge. The genetic crisis demonstrates how ideological rigidity can obstruct scientific understanding, creating situations where political or social beliefs prevent societies from addressing urgent medical realities. The Spanish Habsburg genetic experiment represents one of history's most striking examples of the unintended consequences of applying political ideology to human reproduction. What initially emerged as a strategy for preserving political power evolved into a systematic program of genetic destruction, ultimately annihilating one of the world's most influential dynasties. The tragedy of Princess Margarita Theresa and King Carlos II serves as a permanent reminder of the importance of genetic diversity and the dangers of allowing ideology to override biological reality. Their suffering, recorded in extensive historical documents, provides modern society with crucial insights into the connection between hereditary health and social organization. The collapse of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty marked the end of an era in European history, demonstrating that even the most powerful institutions are ultimately vulnerable to biological constraints. The royal family that had once dominated European politics was undone not by foreign adversaries or popular revolt, but by the genetic consequences of their own marriage practices. The lessons of this crisis remain relevant today, as advances in reproductive technology and genetic engineering create new avenues for both beneficial and potentially harmful interventions in human heredity. The Habsburg example offers a historical lens through which to examine contemporary challenges, underscoring the importance of maintaining genetic diversity and avoiding the ideological extremism that led to the Spanish royal family's downfall. Ultimately, the Spanish Habsburgs left a monument not of marble or bronze, but encoded within the genetic legacy of their descendants and the extensive records documenting the systematic destruction of their bloodline. Their story functions as both tragedy and warning, demonstrating the futility of attempting to transcend human biological limitations through political ideology and dynastic ambition. The stench surrounding Princess Margarita Theresa was more than a medical symptom. It was the physical manifestation of genetic collapse, a warning of an empire decaying from within. Carlos's struggles with speech, mobility, and cognition were not merely personal afflictions. They were emblematic of the breakdown of the entire Spanish political system. Together, these royal siblings embodied the final chapter of a genetic experiment that spanned generations and ultimately consumed the dynasty that had created it. The very blood the Habsburgs sought to preserve had become their poison. The empire they built through strategic marriages crumbled under the weight of accumulated genetic failures. Their fall remains a permanent lesson. Power without wisdom, ideology divorced from science, and rigid tradition will inevitably fail, leaving only bitter lessons learned too late by those who paid the ultimate price for their ancestors' hubris.